Do you still understand that you're free to come and go as you please? You're not under arrest at all?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Do you know what sort of person would kill 4 children?
I have no comprehension. I don't even want to think about it.
Kathy, did you kill Caleb?
No!
Did you kill Patrick?
No!
Did you try to kill Patrick on that near-miss episode?
No!
Did you kill Sarah?
No.
And did you kill Laura?
No.
We're joined again in this episode of Australian True Crime by guest host, criminologist and forensic anthropologist Dr. Xanthé Mallett.
Today, I've got a fantastic guest with me, award-winning investigative journalist Quentin McDermott. Following 6 years at Granola Television in the UK, he joined the ABC as the supervising producer on Lifeline before moving to Four Corners in 2000 as a senior investigative reporter and producer. He is the ABC producer of the critically acclaimed and award-winning documentary Stop at Nothing, the Lance Armstrong story. At Australian Story, his piece on Kathleen Folbigg helped trigger a judicial inquiry in 2018, and he's covered her story for the ABC and the Australian ever since.
This is Australian True Crime. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast is created, the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And a warning, this episode of the podcast contains graphic descriptions of violence.
The reason for our chat today is really, the impetus is a new book that you've got out called Meadow's Law, which nobody can see me holding up, but I've got in my sticky little hand right now. I've got a copy here. Awesome book.
Thank you.
But let's go back to the beginning of your interest in the Kathleen Folbigg case, how all that came about.
I have a mate called Peter Gill, who's a champion bridge player.
Oh, yes. Oh, I know Peter. Yeah.
And as you know, Peter and his mates, his bridge-playing mates, have a kind of obsession, he won't mind me saying this, with the former senior Crown prosecutor, Mark Tedeschi, and all the cases that he prosecuted. And one of the most famous cases he prosecuted was the case of Gordon Wood, who was convicted of throwing his then-girlfriend, Caroline Byrne, over the cliffs at the Gap in Sydney, which was then a notorious suicide spot. And when I arrived in Australia in 1999, and then I joined Four Corners, I started looking at this case. And for years and years and years, I was kind of digging into it, and I was talking to various people about the case. And then eventually, after Gordon Wood appealed his conviction, I reported a story for Four Corners, which questioned his guilt, essentially. And we put this story to air after the appeal court hearing had taken place, but before the 3 judges had handed down their verdict. And when they did, in early 2012, they delivered a verdict that acquitted Gordon Wood, but also that heavily criticised Mark Tedeschi, the senior Crown prosecutor.
Gordon Wood will be a free man after a Sydney appeal court tore up his conviction for the murder of his girlfriend Caroline Byrne.
I have reviewed the whole of the evidence and have concluded that I am not satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that Gordon Wood murdered Caroline Byrne as charged. Accordingly, he must be acquitted.
Peter Gill came to me after that, and he started encouraging me to look at other cases which have been prosecuted by Mr. Tedeschi, one of the most interesting and notorious of which was the case of Kathleen Folbigg.
Kathleen Folbigg has been spared a life sentence but will spend at least 30 years behind bars for the manslaughter of her first baby Caleb and the murders of those who followed, Patrick, Sarah and Laura. The judge said Folbigg would serve a hard jail term and would need to be protected from the danger of being killed by other inmates. Currently, she's locked up for all but 2 hours a day, a situation likely to continue indefinitely.
I think it was so politically unpopular when the questions started to be asked. I mean, whenever I wrote about Kath's case, I used to get really aggressive, vicious, violent emails saying you're defending a baby killer. And it took a long time for that kind of rhetoric around the case to change. So it was politically so unpopular to look at this case. You know, she was Australia's worst female serial killer. And so I think it was just too hot a topic to touch. Nobody wanted to be the person that released Kathleen Folbigg.
I kind of pitched it in a slightly half-hearted way to Four Corners, and we didn't do it. We didn't do a story on it for Four Corners because, to be frank, I hadn't done enough research. I hadn't done enough work on it. But then later on, I joined Australian Story as a producer in 2017. And then the following year in 2018, we put out this episode on Kathleen, which raised significant questions about her guilt. And it was after that, 9 days after that, that Mark Speakman, then the Attorney General of New South Wales, got up and said, I'm calling an inquiry into her convictions.
In 2003, Kathleen Folbigg was convicted of the homicides of her 4 children. In 2015, a petition on behalf of Ms Folbigg was presented to His Excellency the Governor. On my recommendation, His Excellency the Governor has today directed an inquiry into Ms Folbigg's convictions. Can I say this has been an immensely difficult decision. Put yourself in the position of Ms Folbigg's ex-husband, Craig Folbigg. The worst thing that can happen to anyone in their life, I believe, is to lose a child. Just imagine what it must be like to lose 4 children. The distress that today's decision will cause is something that has weighed on me heavily in formulating this recommendation to the Governor. But in the end, my job is to uphold confidence in the administration of justice.
So that was a very significant moment, and that's the way in which I got into the story. But the other highly significant thing, which was completely fortuitous, and I didn't know this was going to happen, was that a young lawyer who was scientifically trained in genetics, Dave Wallace, saw the Australian Story, and it reminded him of the work that he had done as a science student, where he had come to the conclusion on his own terms, if you like, that Kathleen's convictions were potentially unsafe. And he thought that there might be a genetic reason for the deaths of all or some of the children, the 4 children. And he then got in touch with Professor Carola Vinuesa, under whom he had worked as a science student, and he persuaded her to get involved. And that is how, indirectly, this is no credit to me at all or to Australian Story, but quite fortuitously, as I say, and really everything flowed from there.
It's really those sliding doors moments, though, isn't it? Like these things that happen. And actually, just as a little insight into how I got involved in Kath's case. So your book is called Meadow's Law, and I want to get onto the title later because I don't think like 99.9% of people listening are going to know who Professor Sir Roy Meadows is, which this book is named after. But I know because when I was doing my PhD many years ago now, I won't say how many because it makes me feel old, but when I was doing my PhD, I was looking at forensic evidence, some statistical evidence, and the law. But I looked at when expert evidence went wrong. And I covered Professor Sir Roy Meadows' cases of alleged child murder, which was what he was famous for in the UK. He's a British paediatrician, very eminent at the time that he gave evidence in some very high-profile child death cases where the women were accused of murdering their children. And those women were found guilty, but those cases were later overturned because his evidence was unreliable. And so I was very well aware of Professor Sir Roy Meadows. Fast forward to 2012, I moved to Australia and I came across Kath's case and I saw the links that basically Sir Roy Meadows' evidence was still being used to support Kath's conviction and the fact that it was safe. And I found that really frightening because I knew what had happened in the UK. He'd been totally discredited by this point. The cases had been overturned. And it frankly horrified me. His name was still being used in child death cases. And that here, nobody seemed to realise that had been totally discredited. So that was actually the reason I started researching my book on mothers who murder. That's the headline, : and infamous miscarriages of justice. And here's the whole reason that I also wrote my first book. And that was really instigated by Kath's case. And then Kath contacted me via Tracy and various other people. And that's kind of those sliding doors moments too. Because if I hadn't known about Sir Roy Meadow, hadn't seen Kath's case, I wouldn't have written the book. And the rest, they say, is history.
Yeah, and as you say, not only sliding doors, but it is so significant, the role that Professor Sir Roy Meadow played in all these cases.
Unbelievable.
And one of the things that struck me in researching Kathleen's case, of course, is that the most famous of these cases in the UK, the case of Sally Clark.
Oh, yeah, terrible.
Was overturned. She won her second appeal literally a couple of months before Kathleen went on trial in 2003. And I think the argument would have been that, there were very different cases and so on and so on and so on. And so they went ahead.
Sally Clark is a particularly heartbreaking case. Sally Clark was an English solicitor who, in November 1999, was the victim of a miscarriage of justice on the back of Sir Roy Meadow's evidence. She was found guilty of the murder of her 2 infant children, 2 boys. The first son died in 1996, he was only a few weeks old, and the second son died in similar circumstances in 1998. Now, a month later, she was arrested, tried for both. She was found guilty, even though the defence argued that this was sudden infant death syndrome, which was the same in Kath's case. So relied on the evidence of Sir Roy Meadows. This was finally overturned. However, she was released from prison, but she was so damaged psychologically from the trauma that she'd suffered that she died shortly afterwards. And so that is, I think, one of the most tragic cases, given she was entirely innocent. She was a grieving mother, imprisoned, and as a result, she basically drank herself to death. She died of alcohol poisoning in 2007. And that, to me, that is on Sir Roy Meadows and the erroneous evidence that he gave in her case. What is Meadows' law? What was he saying about these women and multiple deaths within families? Because those are the cases we're really talking about when more than one child dies in a family.
Yeah, so what he said, Xanthé, was this, that he came up with this theory that for one infant to die in a family is, of course, a tragedy. For 2 infants to die in the same family is suspicious. And for 3 infants in the same family to die is murder, essentially, or infanticide, if you like, until proven otherwise. And it's interesting here, and this feeds into the whole idea of parents and the role of mothers and fathers, because there were 2 medical examiners in the United States, whose surname is DeMaio, who came up with an almost identical theory. And I talk about this in the book because one of the interesting things is that one of the DeMaio medical examiners wrote to a specialist pediatrics magazine in the United States, putting forward the opinion that when these homicides occurred, it was almost always the mother who carried them out.
Right, okay, which statistically is not true, actually. Around 27 children die in Australia at the hands of a carer every year. That's filicide is what it's described as. And half of those will be male and half will be female. So everyone thinks it's the mother, and that is statistically incorrect.
Yes, and you're quite right to point that out, Xanthé. And in my opinion, the DeMaios and indeed Professor Sir Roy Meadow based their theory, which was, as I say, was almost identical, on no, substantial research evidence whatsoever. So this is the point I want to make, is that one of the people who we interviewed for our Australian story episode was a British mathematician called Professor Ray Hill. And he wrote a paper. The conclusion he came to, and he's certainly done his research far better than Professor Sir Roy Meadow, is that he's a statistician. And he said, one of the horrendous problems with cases like this is the misuse of statistics. He said that in his opinion, he wrote a paper saying this, single cot deaths outweigh single infant murders by 17-1. Double cot deaths outweigh double infant murders by about 9-1. And triple cot deaths outweigh triple murders by about 2-1.
So it's twice as likely that a child would die of cot death 3 times. 3 children within the same family would die of SIDS, or cot death, as it may have been known back then, depends when he wrote it, than would have been murdered.
Yeah.
So actually, the stats that it was, from memory, I think Sir Roy Meadow said it was like 23 million chance that 2 children or 3 children would die in a family of cot death.
Yeah.
Which makes it so unbelievable. But actually, it's twice as likely they die of natural causes than be murdered.
Exactly. So, people have got that all wrong.
And the problem with the stats is what Sir Roy Meadows did, and I won't bore anyone with the heavy level stats, but basically he took the likelihood of one child dying of sudden infant death and the likelihood of another child dying totally independently and just times them together.
Yes.
And then he added another one and times it together again.
That's right.
He treated them as what we would call in stats world independent variables, as if they had nothing to do with each other at all. However, we know that children who die of sudden infant death, we may not understand why they die, but we know that there are links between those deaths, be those environmental, genetic, a combination of social factors, whatever. There are reasons which make it more likely, in fact, that if you've lost one child to SIDS, you're more likely to lose a second. And therefore, the risks actually go up because there's something within your genetic or family that is actually predisposing them. Now, we didn't understand what it was in Kath's case. We do now. This situation is a tragic set of circumstances where 2 people's DNA created a situation where children were predisposed to die young. The variables were always dependent. And that stupid mistake that people make because they just don't understand basic statistical principles is what led to Meadows' law and led to a number of women being prosecuted and going to prison, Sally Clark's death, and Kath losing 20 years of her life.
Absolutely. And the other point about Kathy's case, poor woman, is that at her committal hearing before the trial, when she was committed for trial, there was a paper written by an American pediatrician called Janice Ophoven. And she wrote the paper saying essentially these were homicides and that the chances of all 4 deaths being natural was 1 in a trillion.
Wow.
Okay. Now, you're quite right to laugh, Xanthé, but, when you think about that was publicized, that was published at the time.
Yeah.
So, of course, that helped to cement the public view, that it was completely inconceivable.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the point, isn't it, of numbers? It's numbers beyond, I can't even imagine how many zeros on the end of a trillion. Yeah. It's ridiculous.
But, of course, what that meant is that in Kathy's case, when her 4th child, Laura, died in 1999, and Meadows' law was kind of an accepted theory, it meant that from there on in, essentially, they believed, the police believed, and I think also probably the forensic pathologists believed.
That's where this started, with the forensic pathologists.
Exactly. That this had to be murder.
Yes, Professor Carla knew about... Now, this I have a problem with, is I've given expert evidence. And as an expert, when you're employed by either prosecution or defence, it doesn't matter. You need to just assess the evidence that's in front of you. You're not meant to take extraneous information into account, which could consciously or subconsciously prejudice your report. Now, with this case, Professor Carla, who did the 4th post-mortem on Laura, he knew about the previous 3 children's deaths. All 3 children, the previous 3 that had sadly died, had a medical condition that was known before death, and they were given as natural causes at death. So there was no suspicion about any of those 3 children. But with Laura's death, he would have given natural causes because there were medical issues that were documented before she died. However, he knew about the previous 3 and said if it hadn't been for that, he'd have given natural causes. Now, that to me is a huge red flag, because if his evidence from his post-mortem, which is what he's meant to base his report on, says natural causes, and he is letting other things influence it, that to me is prejudicial. He also knew about the diaries. And have you read the diaries?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah, me too. And when I read them, and I got a copy quite early on after my book came out, so I already believed there was reasonable doubt. But I'd only seen the snippets of the diaries that were released at trial, which were those obviously selected to try and insinuate guilt.
Kathleen Folbigg had killed 3 of her children and was pregnant with her 4th when she wrote in her diary about the day her memories would come to the surface. "That will be the day to lock me up and throw away the key," she wrote, "something I'm sure will happen one day."
So I read the whole thing, And nowhere in those diaries does Kath ever say that she intentionally harmed those children. Yes, she exhibits guilt, remorse, all of those emotions. But you put that in, to me, there was always two readings of it. It could either be a woman who's intentionally harmed these children, thus those emotions, or these are the emotions of a woman who is deeply traumatized from the death of her 4 children whom she couldn't protect and keep alive. Now, if I had a child that died of SIDS, I would feel guilt,
of course,
and remorse and all of that. Of course you do, because you're trying to nurture that thing that relies on you. And so guilt is a totally normal emotional response in that context. And there was always 2 ways to read those diaries. And when I saw them, I was like, there's nothing in here that convinces me of her guilt.
Yeah, absolutely so. So she's tried in 2003 and her defense team fails to call a single psychologist or expert witness or psychiatrist to say, this is what any mother, as you have said, any mother whose child has died on their watch would do. They would feel guilt and they would express that.
This whole notion that we don't have any evidence of families like the Folbiggs with multiple deaths is rubbish. It existed. There was research from the UK, similar demographic to the Folbiggs, multiple children dying in one family for all sorts of genetic, environmental, etc. There are so many reasons why children can die of SIDS that all kind of combine that we just don't understand. But the evidence existed at the time of Kath's trial, and I find that infuriating.
Yes, and in actual fact, that is one of the reasons why, or maybe the key reason why Mr. Speakman, the Attorney General in 2019, called the first inquiry, because he said that there was a doubt or significant doubt about the evidence that had been given at trial, that there had been no previous cases like this. And just leaping forward to that inquiry, one of the things that I found astonishing in looking back at it and the evidence that was presented at the trial, at the first inquiry, and how it was presented in the first place by Gail Finesse, counsel assisting, was that she kind of admitted this right at the outset. She said, yes, it's, essentially she was saying, she didn't put it in these words, but she essentially was saying the trial was misled about this. And in my book, that should have sent the case straight to the Court of Criminal Appeal, because, the jury was misled about previous incidences of families with infants, multiple infants who died from natural causes.
Because all of the jury needed to be presented by the defence was a reasonable alternative to murder. Now, the fact that that evidence existed, that had been, families had been studied, multiple children dying, 2, 3, 4 children within a family, nothing suspicious. The fact that the jury did not hear that evidence as a genuine alternative to murder, absolutely, it should have gone back to Court of Appeal. But you and I were both at that inquiry. We met at the courthouse in Sydney, didn't we? We had to tell you about that.
That's absolutely right.
And we were both sitting there, and I wasn't there for the entire inquiry, but I saw enough of it. It felt to me, and I'd be interested in your opinion, but it felt to me like it was a foregone conclusion, that this was basically lip service. Mark Speakman had called this inquiry because there was significant public pressure. There was enough to make him do something. But it felt to me like a foregone conclusion. The convictions were going to be upheld. That was the way it ran. It was a very strange inquiry from what I remember.
Let me put it this way. I think there was certainly, a feeling amongst those, if you like, on Kathy's team, that they didn't like the way in which the whole inquiry was being conducted from the point of view of it. An inquiry is, to state the obvious, an inquiry is supposed to inquire. Mm-hmm. And some of the questioning of some of the experts was really quite hostile, very disrespectful, to be frank. And then when Kathleen herself volunteered to appear and talk about her diaries and the entries she had made and to explain them, she was brutally cross-examined.
Margaret Kineen.
Yes, Margaret Kineen.
I remember this because
that's right.
This was very strange that Margaret, who was representing Craig Folbigg, Kathleen's ex-husband and father of the children, was allowed to cross-examine Kath in a very inquisitorial manner, very aggressively. And she had the original diaries. And I remember everyone was looking around the court because we had not known where those original diaries were for a really long time. And she had them. Margaret Kineen had them. And she would not allow Kath to explain herself. She was choosing select bits from the diaries in an attempt to make it look like she'd basically said she'd intentionally harmed the children, and wouldn't allow her to really explain. She kept cutting off. It was very aggressive. It did not feel that it was an attempt to get to the truth. And I was very surprised that that process was allowed to take place the way it did. It was so unusual.
Yeah, me too. As you say, she was there to represent Kathleen's ex-husband's, Craig Folbigg's, interest.
And to make sure he wasn't, any of his conduct was called into question. She was there representing him. So why she was questioning Kath on the diaries lost me.
Yes, and she questioned her for a very considerable time. She was hostile. She was. I felt her tone was extremely condescending and quite intimidating. I think she was trying to humiliate her, and some of the language that Margaret Cunneen used was kind of extraordinary. And she and another senior counsel who grilled Kathleen challenged Kathleen probably about 69 or 70 times over 2.5 days to admit that she had killed one or more of the children. And so this was not framed in, the format of a neutral inquiry saying, okay, Ms. Folbigg, will you please explain what you meant by this? And then moving on to the next one. It was framed in a very, as you say, inquisitorial.
And accusatory.
Yes.
It was being managed, to me, more like a criminal trial where somebody has been accused of a crime and they're being cross-examined by the Crown. And that's not what this was meant to be. This was meant to be an inquiry. It's meant to be a fact-finding mission. It's meant to be testing, the veracity of the evidence, yes, but not to the point. And I think Margaret is a fantastic prosecutor and defence. She's done some amazing work, but I did not think she should have been allowed to question Kath about the diaries because it had nothing to do with representing Craig's interests and protecting him. And I think it was totally inappropriate.
I agree. And can I just add to that, what made it even more shocking, in my view, was the fact that the commissioner, the judge, if you like, Reginald Blanche, who's heading up the inquiry, repeated more than once that this was not an adversarial inquiry. And yet, when Kathy was grilled to the nth degree about the diaries, it was definitely adversarial. There was absolutely no question about that. And so, why was he saying, as the judge, the judicial officer, if you like, in charge of the inquiry, why was he saying this is not adversarial, but then allowing this line of questioning to continue?
And sitting there in that court, it was clear from how Blanchard was running that inquiry that the outcome was going to sustain the convictions. There was no doubt in my mind.
If you'd like to talk to someone about abuse that's taken place in your life, no matter how long ago it happened, your GP is always a good place to start. If that's not going to work for you, you can contact 1-800-RESPECT on 1-800-737-732 or via their website 1800respect.org.au. Or you can call Lifeline's 24-hour phone counselling service on 13 11 14.
2018, Reginald Blanche upheld the convictions and said that if anything, correct me if I'm wrong here, but if anything, the evidence he heard further convinced him that Kath was guilty.
Yes, he said that the evidence he had heard at the inquiry reinforced her guilt. He used the word reinforced. And I know from having spoken to people at the time, and indeed this was my own reaction, that people who were kind of in her team, if you like, or supporting her, and a lot of people who I think were just reporting on it or observing the inquiry neutrally, were deeply shocked by that conclusion reached by Reginald Blanche.
I was shocked because I thought he was so wrong, but not shocked because the way the inquiry ran. It felt like a foregone conclusion. I was like, well, yes, I'm not surprised. I've sat it through a few inquiries and it was the oddest I've ever sat through in terms of procedure.
Yes, and of course there was then an appeal against that, and then eventually, to me personally, one of the real heroes of this story is Professor Vinuesa, because she was the one who, following the first inquiry, was, I think, like everyone else, deeply shocked, but who determined to kind of carry on with the scientific inquiries, and she persuaded this kind of international team of scientists to carry out experiments in the lab on this cardiac genetic mutation that she had helped to discover, CARM2G114R.
Rolls off the tongue, doesn't it?
Genetics and immunology expert Professor Carola Vinuesa was part of a team that analysed the genome sequences of Folbigg and her children. In Folbigg's daughters, Sarah and Laura, they discovered a genetic mutation.
The team found a novel variant never before reported in a gene known as CARM2, which encodes for calmodulin. Calmodulin mutations typically are associated with cardiac arrhythmias that can cause sudden unexpected death in children and adults, both while awake and while asleep.
And of course, eventually they wrote a paper together, 27 international scientists and experts.
Totally objective, no skin in this game.
Yeah, exactly. Saying, look, we believe this cardiac mutation is indeed pathogenic.
By which it means that it can lead to early death.
Yes, and most probably triggered the deaths, if you like, tragically, of Kath's two daughters, Sarah and Laura.
And they were still at that point looking at the two boys and whether they had a potentially different genetic mutation that resulted in their death. But what we have now is, so Kath was basically found guilty on the basis that you couldn't, it was just totally unreasonable to assume that 4 children would just die randomly within a family, right? That was what the Crown kind of suggested was the only other alternative. But no one was actually genuinely ever suggesting that these were just unlucky, random, disconnected events. It was clear that there was a causative factor, but what was not presented at trial was that there was potentially another cause. Now we have scientifically, objectively published, peer-reviewed journal article saying 2 of the children are likely to have died of this genetic mutation. Now, if you take the 2 girls out of the mix and you've got the 2 boys there, suddenly you don't have a pattern anymore which supports that Kath murdered these 4 children, or she was found guilty of 4 and the manslaughter of the 4th. So you take the girls out, what are you left with? The 2 boys. And that destroys the whole Crown argument right there.
Absolutely. And I think, in the end, at the second inquiry, when the second inquiry was finally called following this extraordinary petition.
Eventually, it took a bloody long time. So what happened, as we all know, is, the first inquiry came back with Reginald Blanche saying, the evidence I've heard reinforces her guilt. Then these 27 international scientists, they produced a paper saying, well, actually, we've taken this further. We've carried out these experiments in several labs around the world. We've discovered that this CARM2 mutation is pathogenic and almost certainly triggered the deaths of the 2 girls. And then there's the petition, this extraordinary petition in March of 2021, signed or endorsed, if you like, eventually by 3 Nobel laureates and 150 scientists and science advocates saying, on the basis of this new, fresh scientific evidence, we are calling for Kathleen to be pardoned and released. And then Mark Speakman then sits on this for another year before the second inquiry is called. Now, this was unprecedented that scientists felt that they had to come out. Scientists generally do not dabble in criminal justice. They stay in their lane and they expect the criminal justice system to do its job. So the fact that these scientists felt the need to write this letter, this open letter, which incidentally, again for our listeners, is not dissimilar to what happened to Soro Meadows back in the UK after the Clark, etc. cases, the Royal Statistical Society wrote a letter saying that his evidence was manifestly misleading, I think was one of the terms that they used, because they were horrified with how he had totally butchered the statistics because he didn't know what he was doing. And the Royal Statistical Society wrote this letter. Now that at the time was unprecedented, right? Roy Meadows was eventually struck off before he was reinstated as a doctor, but there was serious implications. And the same thing happened here. The law made a huge mistake, and it took a bunch of scientists to write an open letter to really put pressure on Mark Speakman, who then sat on it for a year, to call the second inquiry.
Yes, this actually couldn't have happened, in my opinion, without the support of the Australian Academy of Science. And I want to mention, two people in relation to that. One is Anna Maria Arabia, who is the CEO of the Australian Academy, because she kind of led that drive, if you like, to simply kind of say it straight out that from a scientific point of view, that there was the strongest possible evidence that these convictions were unsafe. And the other person who kind of chimed in on that and lent his voice to it was Professor John Shine, who was then the president of the Australian Academy of Science, who kind of backed this very much and made multiple statements. And particularly when Mark Speakman was not reaching a decision on the petition, he made multiple statements through that whole period saying, look, the time has come actually for a decision to be made on this and for Kathleen to be pardoned and released. Mark Speakman, I'm just going to say this because this was his kind of argument. His argument was that he didn't receive all of the paperwork that needed to be considered until later on in 2021. And then, of course, finally, when he announced a second inquiry, he declined to actually go ahead and pardon Kathleen and release her, which he had the power to do. But instead, he called the second inquiry. But as you, Xanthé, I know, will agree, the whole tone and format of the second inquiry was completely different.
Absolutely. I watched a lot of it online with one of my colleagues, actually, because I was running the Justice Clinic at the University of Newcastle at this point. And it was very different. And to me, the sense was that the convictions were going to be overturned. But what I was actually shouting, and I do not raise my voice, Quentin, very often, but I remember shouting at the school, and we had students in the office next door because they still mentioned Sir Roy Meadows in that second inquiry in, would that be 2022?
Yeah, so it started in, I think, November 2022. And when Michael Toft Overgaard and Mette Nyegaard, the two professors from Denmark, gave their initial evidence, and because their initial evidence was actually quite groundbreaking, because they discovered further evidence supporting the idea that this cardiac mutation was pathogenic, it was then kind of postponed, the inquiry, until I think it was February 2023, and then it recommenced. And the main part of the inquiry took place in early 2023. And then Tom Bathurst, the judge who was heading up that inquiry, gave his opinion during the kind of final days of the hearing that there was indeed now reasonable doubt surrounding her convictions. And then not long after that, he wrote a short memo for the new Labour Attorney General, Michael Daly. And in June of 2023, Mr. Daly got up and said, right, I've advised the governor that Kathleen should be pardoned and released. And she was released kind of very suddenly. And then it was 6 months after that, in December 2023, that the case finally went before three judges at the Court of Criminal Appeal who agreed, unanimously that she should be acquitted on all charges. And so at that point, she became, in the eyes of the law, an innocent woman.
Kathleen Folbigg spent 20 years in jail hoping and praying for this moment.
I hope that no one else will ever have to suffer what I've suffered. I am grateful that updated science and genetics has given me answers as to how my children died. For almost a quarter of a century, I faced disbelief and hostility. I suffered abuse in all its forms.
But not anymore. Now the court says she's a mother who experienced unspeakable loss.
My children are here with me today, and they will be close to my heart for the rest of my life.
But you and I both know, long before this, there was always reasonable doubt. This case is so infuriating. It should never have gone to court. Alan Carla, the pathologist, should never have raised concerns about Laura's post-mortem because it was clear she died of natural causes. And so many people, and Professor Roy Meadow and various other people, will have a lot to answer for, I think. Tedeschi being one of them, the way the case was run. But there was always reasonable doubt. And obviously I wrote that in, 2014, 2013, when my book came out. it just took a decade for the science to catch up.
Yes, and I think, Mr. Tedeschi, there's no question that Mr. Tedeschi, when he was senior Crown prosecutor, was an extraordinarily effective Crown prosecutor.
That's a very polite way to put that. I have some other thoughts about Mark Tedeschi.
And extremely persuasive. But one of the passages that, in his closing address, I think was, to be frank, shameful, really, where he said that, and I'm going to paraphrase, but he said, look, it's possible, yes, of course, that all 4 of these children, each of them in turn, could have died from natural causes. But it's also possible that Farmer Joe would wake up one morning, he'd look out of the window, he'd see 4 piglets born to a sow. Not a great metaphor, by the way, to use in a case like this. And the piglets had sprouted wings and flown away. So what he was saying there was, apart from this kind of misogynistic metaphor, he was saying, yes, it's possible that they might all, each of them have died of natural causes, one after the other, but pigs might fly. And I think the reason I think that's shameful, apart from the choice of metaphor, is because it was, as you indicated earlier, was simply untrue. He was saying this is literally not possible. It is literally impossible. And of course, that isn't the case, because there were previous cases of multiple infants in families dying from natural causes.
Well, I'm not a fan of Tedeschi, but I'll keep it polite. And that's because he liked winning the unwinnable cases. And I do not approve of the way he won them, because to me, a Crown prosecutor is not there to win for their ego because they like winning. The Crown prosecutor is there to prosecute people who are believed to be guilty. They should believe that they're guilty. It's not about just a game of winning. And I don't think he probably chose the metaphor. I think that was probably intentional. And the fact that he would have known that there was evidence in families similar demographic to the Folbiggs, that to me is just horrendous, that somebody would rather send an innocent woman to prison for ostensibly the rest of her life as it looked then. She was given 40 years originally, and that was reduced at appeal to 30, but 40 years. And he probably knew then that there was reasonable doubt. That to me is unforgivable. But to come back to the book, you called it Meadow's Law, so I think the listeners are going to understand now why, because this really started with Sir Roy Meadows. Without his law and the evidence he'd given in the UK, she may never have gone to trial. Anything else you want to tell us about the book? Tease us a little bit. What else? What other revelations there are in the book?
There are, I think, 1 or 2 significant revelations in the book. In the kind of zeitgeist of the time, and particularly as we talked about earlier, when poor Laura died in 1999, Meadow's Law was in the ascendant. And Professor John Hilton, no less, who had carried out the autopsy on Sarah and decided that she had died from SIDS, when he was told about this is one of the revelations in my book, when a police officer came to him and said, there's been a 4th one in the Folbigg family, he said, 4 is fucking murder. Now, that was Professor Hilton. So that's one revelation. And to his credit, he then, his view obviously changed over time, and he became convinced in the end of Kathleen's innocence, and he argued strongly for that and for the natural causes of death for each of the children when he came to the first inquiry. But one of the other big revelations I have in my book is that Kathleen's own senior counsel, the public defender, Peter Zara, clearly believed that she was guilty.
Really?
Yes. And this is based on a very brief private conversation he had with a clinical psychologist, who I'm sure you know, Sharmila Betts.
I do.
When she met him after, I think it was a kind of law conference, law symposium, the year after Kathy was convicted, so in 2004, and she said to him words, and again I'm paraphrasing, she said to him words to the effect of, that was a terrible miscarriage of justice, wasn't it? And he said, he kind of looked at her and said, you wouldn't think that if you had read the diaries. In other words, he clearly believed
she was guilty,
that the diaries were damning. And one of the great failings of the defense, so we've kind of targeted Mr. Tedeschi, but one of the great failings of the defense at her trial, in my opinion, is that they didn't bring to give evidence a single psychologist or psychiatrist who might have given an alternative view of what she'd written in the diaries. It takes 20 years, literally 20 years, until 2023 in the second inquiry, when these expert psychological and psychiatric witnesses were actually called to give evidence. And every single one of them at the second inquiry said, we find nothing in the diaries to suggest culpability and nothing in the diaries to suggest agency in deliberately harming, let alone killing, any of the children. Now, think how different that might have been, the whole trial might have been, if 3 or 4 of those witnesses had appeared in 2003 or similar witnesses. It just didn't happen. One of the things I researched, and in fact, during the first inquiry, I drew this to the attention of Kathleen's legal team, is that after Laura died, the police installed listening equipment into their home, okay? And one of the conversations they recorded was between Craig and Kathleen, which I think took place kind of early one morning, where Craig essentially, this was, I think, in their living room. Craig comes downstairs, says hello to Kath, and he says, this is a direct quote from a police transcript, "All night I've been thinking, maybe I killed the kids." Now, the whole point of him saying this, I'd have to make this crystal clear, was not as a confession, but it was as he was painting a scenario of why it was equally possible for him to have killed the kids as Kathy, because they both realized at that point, he was supporting her totally at that point. Okay, this is early on in the police investigation. He was supporting his wife. And he was saying, he was basically having a go at Bernie Ryan, who was the leading detective in the investigation. And he was essentially saying, I could have killed the kids too. And in this conversation, which was secretly recorded, not only did he say, "All night I've been thinking maybe I killed the kids," but he went on to explain exactly how he could have done that and the motive he could have had for doing so. The motive being that each of the deaths in turn placed enormous strain on their relationship. And also, she was caught up with the kids and so on. And this was a way of him kind of getting her attention back, essentially, to kill them. I mean, that's horrendous, but this was the motive, essentially, that he put forward. Now, the revelation I made about this in the book is not only to go through this secretly recorded discussion in detail, which has never been written about in detail before, as far as I know, but also to point out that most of that conversation was suppressed at Kathy's trial, and in my opinion, it shouldn't have been. And the whole conversation, after I brought it to the attention of her lawyers for the first inquiry, they, submitted it, but the whole of it was redacted at the first inquiry.
Because it raised doubt.
Yes, because it raised doubt. And in his report on the evidence, Reginald Blanche, the judge in charge of the first inquiry, essentially he said, I'm left with the inevitable conclusion that these children were smothered and there is only one person who could have done that, Kathleen. And so by completely redacting and suppressing this conversation, he essentially made it possible for himself to suggest that there was no other possible candidate. But in all of the diaries that Kathy wrote, and in all of the recorded conversations and statements, and interviews given to the police and so on, only one of the parents at any point put forward a scenario where they might have killed the children, and that was Craig.
Mm.
So I'm not suggesting, I want to make it crystal clear, no one is suggesting that Craig did anything he shouldn't have, and Kathy doesn't believe he did. But the fact that this evidence was acquired by the police and then suppressed, I think is completely shameful. Out of all of this, I think the criminal justice system has a lot to answer for. I won't name names, but I think the criminal justice system as a whole in New South Wales did everything it could to keep her behind bars.
Absolutely, it did.
For the entirety of her sentence, and was their minds, I think, were very closed to the real possibility that a terrible error had been made. And it was only finally at the second inquiry in 2023 that Tom Bathurst made the right decision. Even now, when I meet people, Xanthé, friends of mine or people who, I just get into a conversation with about Kathleen and they kind of go, 4 deaths,
Oh, God, so frustrating.
They still do. And the other thing is they actually do say to me, what do you think? Did she do it?
No, she bloody didn't.
I mean, still, after all this time.
I thought I knew this case, but there's obviously things you've discovered that I didn't know, that other people won't know either. So fantastic job on the book. I look forward to seeing you at the BAD Sydney Crime Writers Festival in September. And anyone who's listening that wants to come along, you'll have your book there, won't you? And they can get a copy.
Oh, 100%. Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
You'll be able to get a signed copy. So that's a fantastic opportunity to come and ask any questions of Quentin that you might have. So thank you for your time today. And I look forward to seeing you in a few weeks.
Looking forward to it. Thanks very much indeed.
If you need support after listening to this podcast, you can call Lifeline on 13 11 14 or contact 1800-RESPECT on 1800 737 732 or 1800respect.org.au. Indigenous Australians can contact 13 Yarn on 13 92 76 or 13yarn.org.au.
The producers of this podcast recognise the traditional owners of the land on which it's recorded. They pay respect to the Aboriginal elders past, present and those emerging.